A freezing night, a single act of kindness, and the deafening roar of 100 choppers shaking the asphalt, when a shivering teenager handed over his only winter jacket to a stranded Hell's Angel. He thought he'd made a quiet sacrifice. He had no idea he'd just summoned an army. The wind howling through the Cascade Mountains that November sounded less like moving air, and more like a wounded animal tearing through the pines. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the temperature had plummeted to a brutal 14 degrees. Inside Cooper's Gas and Grub, a dilapidated service station sitting entirely alone on a desolate stretch of Highway 26, 17-year-old Toby Harrison was desperately trying to stay awake. Toby wasn't supposed to be working the graveyard shift. He was a high school junior, carrying a solid B average despite operating on a permanent deficit of sleep. But his mother, a waitress at a diner 3 towns over, had recently had her hours cut, and the stack of red-stamped past-due bills on their kitchen table was growing into a small mountain. Toby had begged his manager, a gruff old man named Arthur Pendleton, for the extra hours. Arthur had agreed, leaving Toby alone to manage the pumps, the stale coffee, and the terrifying isolation of the mountain pass in the dead of winter. To combat the biting drafts that slipped through the cracks in the gas station's cheap windows, Toby was wearing his most prized possession, a heavy, fleece-lined, insulated Carhartt jacket. It was practically brand new, a dark, rugged canvas armor that he had saved up for over 3 months. It wasn't just a jacket, it was his survival gear. Toby didn't own a car. Every night at 2 a.m., when his shift ended, he had to walk 2 miles down a pitch-black, unlit dirt road to get back to his family's small, drafty trailer. Without that jacket, the walk was not just miserable, it was actively dangerous. Outside, the first violent flurries of a forecasted blizzard began to slam against the glass. The radio crackled with static, the local DJ warning everyone to stay off the roads. The ice was thickening, turning the asphalt into a black mirror. Then, through the howling wind, Toby heard a sound that made his stomach drop. It was the distinct, heavy, rhythmic sputter of a V-twin motorcycle engine. But it sounded sick. It was coughing, backfiring, and struggling against the gale. Toby wiped a circle of condensation off the glass and peered out into the dark. Beneath the flickering, yellow halo of the single working streetlight in the parking lot, a massive Harley-Davidson lurched to a halt. The engine gave one final, violent shudder and died completely. The rider sat frozen for a moment. Then, with movements that seemed stiff and agonizing, he swung a heavy, leather-clad leg over the seat and kicked the stand down. As the figure walked toward the glowing neon open sign of the convenience store, Toby's pulse quickened. The man was a giant, standing easily 6'4", broad-shouldered and heavy-set. But it wasn't his size that made Toby swallow hard. It was what he was wearing. Over a thin flannel shirt, the man wore a heavy leather vest. Even through the falling snow, Toby could clearly see the patches. The top rocker arched over a grinning skull with wings, the infamous Death Head logo. The bottom rocker proudly declared his territory. It was the full, unmistakable colors of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. In this part of the Pacific Northwest, the Hells Angels were legends, spoken about in hushed tones. They were a fiercely guarded brotherhood, known for their strict codes, their intimidating presence, and their absolute intolerance for disrespect. Seeing one alone, stranded in a blizzard, was like finding a wounded apex predator in your living room. The bells on the door jingled violently as the biker shoved his way inside. A blast of sub-zero air followed him, scattering a stack of lottery tickets off the counter. Toby immediately noticed 2 things. first. The man was older, likely in his late 50s, with a thick, greying beard that was currently caked in solid ice. Second, and more alarming, the man was shivering violently. His lips were a terrifying shade of pale blue, and his skin had the waxy, bloodless look of severe hypothermia. Don't tell me you're closed, kid." The biker rasped. His voice was deep and gravelly, but it trembled so badly he could barely form the words. No, sir," Toby stammered, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "Open till 2. The biker nodded slowly, staggering toward the back of the store where a small, ancient space heater sat glowing orange on the floor. He practically collapsed onto a milk crate beside it, holding his massive, bare, tattooed hands toward the weak heat. His leather vest offered zero protection against the biting cold, and his thin flannel was soaked through with melted snow. "Bike gave out," the man muttered, almost to himself. "Alternator, I think. Lost the headlight 2 miles back. Rode blind until the engine seized." Toby stood frozen behind the register. He had been told by other clerks to never engage with the motorcycle clubs that occasionally passed through during the summer, to just ring them up, keep his head down, and let them leave. But this wasn't a pack of loud, imposing riders. This was one man who looked like he was freezing to death. "I have fresh coffee," Toby offered, his voice cracking slightly. "It's on the house." The biker looked up, his ice-crusted eyebrows raising slightly. Yeah, that'd be good." Toby grabbed a large styrofoam cup and filled it to the brim with the steaming, black sludge that had been sitting on the burner for the last 2 hours. He walked around the counter, keeping a respectful distance, and handed it to the massive man. The biker reached for it, but his hands were shaking so uncontrollably that he nearly dropped the cup. Dark coffee sloshed over the rim, burning Toby's knuckles, but he held steady, helping guide the cup to the man's hands until he had a firm grip. "Thanks, sir, kid," the biker grunted, taking a long, scalding sip without even wincing. "Name's Jim. They call me Big Jim Larson." "Toby," the teen replied, taking a step back. "Well, Toby, you picked a hell of a night to work the register," Jim said, offering a weak, shivering smile. The warmth of the coffee seemed to bring a tiny bit of color back to his face, but the violent shaking didn't stop. Hypothermia had already set in deep into his core. Do you need me to call someone? Mr. Larson?" Toby asked. "A tow truck, the police." Jim's eyes snapped up, flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity. "No cops. I don't need no blue lights out here, and a tow truck ain't gonna do me any good right now." He set the coffee down on the floor, rubbing his hands together. "I ain't out here for a joyride. Kid, my chapter brother, my best friend, Thomas. He's up at St. Jude's Medical Center in Portland. They called me an hour ago. Said he's not making it through the night. I gotta be there." Toby felt a pang of empathy. He remembered the night his own father had passed away in a sterile hospital room, and the desperate, suffocating panic of trying to get there in time to say goodbye. "Portland is 40 miles from here," Toby said softly. "The roads are icing over. Even if your bike was running, you'd never make it in this storm. Not dressed like that." Jim let out a frustrated, rattling cough. "I'll hitchhike. I'll walk if I have to. I ain't letting him die alone." The biker tried to stand up, his massive frame towering over Toby, but his legs immediately buckled. He fell back onto the milk crate, his breathing shallow. He was losing the battle against the cold, and the drop in his core temperature was making him uncoordinated and weak. Toby looked out the window. The snow was falling thicker now, a blinding white sheet obscuring the highway. Nobody was driving in this. Hitchhiking was a death sentence. Toby remembered that old man Henderson, a local freight hauler, was parked around the back of the station, sleeping in his cab before making a late-night run toward Portland. Henderson was a gruff guy, but he owed Toby a few favors for covering up the times he'd left the diesel pumps a mess. "Wait here," Toby said, turning toward the back door. He dashed out into the freezing wind, sprinting around the side of the building to the massive 18-wheeler idling in the dark. He pounded on the heavy metal door until a very grumpy Henderson rolled down the window. After 5 minutes of frantic explaining, pleading, and calling in every favor he had, Toby convinced the trucker. Henderson was heading right past St. Jude's anyway. He agreed to take the biker, but he warned Toby, "I'm leaving in exactly 3 minutes. Kid, if your biker friend ain't in the cab by then, I'm rolling without him." Toby sprinted back inside, practically sliding across the linoleum floor. "Jim, I got you a ride. A trucker out back is heading straight to Portland. He can drop you 2 blocks from the hospital." Relief washed over the giant biker's face. He forced himself to stand, grabbing the counter for support. "Kid, I owe you. You have no idea." But as Jim stood up and the door to the station blew open, letting in a horrifying blast of sub-zero wind, Toby realized a fatal flaw in the plan. The truck's heater had been broken for weeks. Henderson drove in a heavy parka. Jim, shivering violently in his wet flannel and leather vest, wouldn't survive the 40-mile, slow-moving drive in a freezing truck cab. Jim felt the wind and stopped in his tracks, his teeth chattering so loudly it echoed in the quiet store. He looked down at his own trembling hands, realizing the grim reality of his situation. He was too cold. He wasn't going to make it. Toby looked at the clock. It was 12:30 a.m. He looked at Jim, who was staring out the door with a look of desperate, quiet defeat. Then, Toby looked down at his heavy, fleece-lined Carhartt jacket. He thought about the 2-mile walk home in the dark. He thought about the biting wind, the ice, and his mother's frantic worrying. He thought about how long it had taken him to save the money for it. 3 minutes, Henderson had said, before his brain could talk him out of it. Toby unzipped his jacket. He slid it off his shoulders, the sudden absence of its warmth sending an immediate, shocking chill down his spine. He held it out toward the towering Hell's Angel. "Take it," Toby said, his voice steady despite the sudden cold. Jim Larson stared at the thick canvas jacket, then looked down at the skinny teenager standing before him in nothing but a faded, thin cotton flannel shirt. The biker's eyes widened in disbelief. "Kid, are you out of your mind?" Jim rasped, stepping back. "You work in a freezer. I saw you looking at that clock. You got to walk home, don't you?" "I'll run," Toby lied smoothly. "It'll keep me warm. You need it more. The truck doesn't have a heater. If you don't take this, you're not going to make it to your brother." Jim hesitated. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, nobody gave you something for nothing. Trust was earned in blood and miles, not handed over a linoleum counter by a kid making minimum wage. But as he looked into Toby's eyes, he saw no angle, no calculation, just a kid trying to help a man in pain. A loud, piercing blast from an air horn shattered the silence outside. Henderson was warning them. Time was up. Jim reached out with a trembling hand and took the jacket. The thick canvas looked almost comical in his massive grip, but as he slid his arms into the fleece-lined sleeves and pulled it tight over his leather cut, a low groan of absolute relief escaped his lips. The heavy insulation immediately trapped his remaining body heat. "Toby," Jim said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the tremor for just a second. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter, tossing it onto the counter. "I don't forget. And the angels don't forget." Before Toby could respond, the giant man turned and pushed his way out into the blizzard, jogging toward the idling semi-truck. Toby watched through the frosted glass as the passenger door swung open. Jim climbed inside, and the massive rig roared to life, disappearing into the blinding white snow. Toby was completely alone again. He walked over to the counter, picked up the heavy Zippo lighter, and slid it into his pocket. It was freezing cold against his leg. The next hour and a half moved at an agonizing crawl, every time the wind hit the windows. Toby shivered. When 2 a.m. finally arrived, he locked the front door, shut off the neon sign, and turned off the lights. He stood by the back door for a long time, staring out into the pitch-black night. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had plummeted even further. It was 10 degrees. Taking a deep breath, Toby pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow. It punched the air out of his lungs. The thin cotton of his flannel shirt offered exactly 0 resistance to the wind. Within 30 seconds, his arms were covered in goosebumps. Within 2 minutes, his teeth were chattering violently. He started to jog, just like he had told Jim he would. But the dirt road was slick with black ice. After slipping and falling hard on his hip, he was forced to slow down to a brisk, agonizingly stiff walk. 1 mile to go, he thought, wrapping his arms tightly around his chest, his hands tucked under his armpits. His fingers were already going numb. He cursed himself. He cursed his bleeding heart instincts. Why did he care about some outlaw biker he had just thrown away 3 months of savings and subjected himself to absolute torture for a total stranger who would probably pawn the jacket for gas money the next day? The cold began to burn. His ears felt like they were being sliced by razor blades. He kept his eyes focused on the ground, placing 1 foot in front of the other, hallucinating the warmth of his trailer. He imagined his mum's space heater. He imagined a hot shower. By the time he finally saw the faint, yellow porch light of his family's trailer, Toby was stumbling. He couldn't feel his feet, and his vision was blurring at the edges. He practically threw himself up the metal steps, fumbling blindly with his keys with wooden, unresponsive fingers. He pushed the door open and collapsed onto the worn carpet of the living room, kicking the door shut behind him. He crawled toward the small heating vent in the floor, curling into a tight ball, shivering so violently that his muscles ached. He lay there for hours, the Zippo lighter pressing hard against his thigh, drifting into a restless, exhausted sleep, convinced he had made the stupidest mistake of his life. He had no idea that a few hours away, in the harsh fluorescent light of a hospital waiting room, Big Jim Larson was making a phone call that was about to turn Toby Harrison's world upside down. The harsh, grey morning light filtering through the frosted windows of the trailer was merciless. Toby groaned, his head pounding with a ferocious, dull ache. He was still curled up on the threadbare carpet directly over the heating vent, clutching his knees to his chest. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass, and a deep, rattling cough tore through his chest the moment he tried to sit up. "Toby, what on earth are you doing on the floor?" His mother, Diane Harrison, stood in the doorway of the tiny kitchen, clutching a chipped ceramic mug of tea. She looked exhausted, the deep circles under her eyes, a permanent fixture since his father passed. When she saw him shivering, still wearing nothing but the thin, damp flannel shirt from the night before, her maternal instincts immediately kicked into overdrive. "Where is your coat?" she demanded, rushing over and pressing a cool hand against his burning forehead. "You're burning up, Toby. Honey, where is your Carhartt?" Toby averted his eyes, staring at the peeling linoleum. I lost it. Mum, I left it at the station. Someone must have swiped it while I was in the back." Diane's face fell. It was a look of pure, unadulterated defeat that broke Toby's heart. That jacket was a symbol of his hard work, an expensive necessity they absolutely could not afford to replace. "Oh, Toby," she whispered, her voice cracking. Okay. We'll figure it out. Get into bed. I'm going to make you some soup." For the next 4 hours, Toby drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the freezing mountain pass and the towering silhouette of Jim Larson disappearing into the snow. He felt a gnawing guilt for lying to his mother, but he couldn't bring himself to explain that he had given away their only valuable piece of winter clothing to a gang member. It was exactly 11:15 a.m. when the noise started. At first, it was just a low, barely perceptible hum. Toby thought it was the old refrigerator kicking into overdrive, but the hum didn't stop. It steadily grew deeper, heavier, vibrating through the thin aluminum walls of the trailer. Diane walked into his cramped bedroom, looking out the small window with a puzzled expression. "Is that a freight train? The tracks are 5 miles away. We shouldn't be able to hear it this loud." The hum escalated into a physical rumble. The water in the glass on Toby's nightstand began to ripple. The framed photograph of his father hanging in the hallway rattled violently against the cheap wood paneling. It sounded like a massive swarm of mechanical hornets was descending upon their quiet, snow-covered dirt road. Toby threw off his blankets, ignoring the dizzying rush of blood to his head, and stumbled to the front window in the living room. He pulled back the faded curtain and felt his blood turn to ice. It wasn't a train. It was an army. Rolling slowly down the narrow, snow-packed lane was a seemingly endless column of motorcycles. They rode in perfect, disciplined, staggered formation, their massive V-twin engines roaring in terrifying, unified harmony. The sheer volume was deafening, echoing off the surrounding pine trees. "Oh my God," Diane breathed, taking a terrified step back. "Toby, get away from the window. Lock the door." But Toby couldn't move. He was paralyzed, watching as over 100 heavily patched bikers rolled into their small cul-de-sac. The chrome of their customized Harley-Davidsons glinted dangerously in the pale winter sun. They wore heavy leather cuts over thick hoodies and flannels, the iconic Death Head logo emblazoned on every single back. The neighbors' curtains were twitching nervously, but nobody dared step outside. The Hells Angels had completely locked down the street. The column came to a halt, the engines idling with a deep, menacing thunder. Then, in a synchronized move that spoke of years of riding together, 100 kickstands slammed down onto the asphalt. The riders dismounted. Toby's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the crowd of massive, bearded men, frantically looking for the familiar face of Jim Larson. But Jim wasn't there. Instead, a man who looked even more intimidating stepped forward from the front of the pack. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a cut that bore the president patch on the front breast. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow and eyes as cold and hard as flint. The man walked straight past the rusty mailbox, up the small concrete walkway, and stood directly in front of the Harrisons' thin metal door. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, waiting. "Toby, I am calling the police right now," Diane said, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her cell phone on the carpet. "No. Toby grabbed her arm. "Mum, don't. Please, just let me handle this." Before she could stop him, Toby reached out with a trembling hand, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. A blast of cold air hit him, carrying the strong, distinct smell of exhaust fumes, stale cigarette smoke, and leather. The man on the porch stared down at Toby. Up close, he was even more terrifying. "You Toby?" the man asked. His voice was a deep, quiet gravel pit. "Yes, sir," Toby managed to squeak out, pulling his flannel tight against his shivering frame. The man nodded slowly. "Name's Wrench, Portland chapter president." He glanced past Toby to where Diane was cowering in the living room. "Ma'am, apologies for the noise. We ain't here to cause trouble." Wrench looked back at Toby and reached into the deep inside pocket of his leather vest. Toby flinched instinctively, but the biker didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a familiar, heavy canvas Carhartt jacket. It looked perfectly clean, smelling faintly of a professional dry cleaner. "Jim asked me to return this to you," Wrench said, holding it out. Toby took it slowly, the familiar weight of it offering a bizarre sense of comfort. Is Jim okay? Did he make it?" Wrench's hard eyes softened just a fraction, a shadow of grief passing over his scarred face. "He made it. Got to St. Jude's at 1:45 a.m. He got exactly 4 hours with Thomas before he passed. He was holding his hand when he took his last breath." Wrench paused, clearing his throat. "Thomas was a founding member of our chapter. He was Jim's sponsor 30 years ago. If Jim hadn't been there to send him off, it would have destroyed him." Wrench took a step closer, towering over the teenager. "Jim was suffering from stage 2 hypothermia when that trucker dropped him off. The doctors at the ER said if he hadn't been wearing this canvas jacket, his heart would have stopped from the cold before he ever reached the city limits." Toby swallowed hard, gripping the jacket tightly. "I'm just glad he made it." "You don't get it, kid," Wrench said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that demanded absolute attention. "You didn't just give a guy a coat, you saved a brother's life, and you gave our chapter the gift of letting Thomas die with his family by his side. In our world, a debt like that isn't something you just say thanks for." Wrench snapped his fingers. A second biker, a tall, lanky man with a long braided beard, stepped up to the porch carrying a thick, heavy manila envelope and a large black garment bag. "Henderson, the trucker. He talks a lot," Wrench explained, taking the envelope. "Told Jim about how you were working graveyard shifts 'cause your old man passed and your mum's struggling with the bills. Told him how you walk 2 miles in the pitch black every night." Wrench shoved the thick envelope into Toby's chest. It was heavy, breathtakingly heavy. "There's $12,000 in there," Wrench stated matter-of-factly. "Every fully patched member in 3 state chapters emptied their wallets this morning. You pay off this trailer. You pay your mum's bills. You quit that graveyard shift and you focus on getting your high school diploma." Diane let out a choked, muffled sob from the hallway, pressing her hands over her mouth in absolute shock. I can't take this," Toby stammered, trying to hand the envelope back. "It was just a jacket. It's not a gift, kid. It's a settled debt. You insult us by handing it back," Wrench warned, though there was a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He then unzipped the black garment bag the other biker was holding. Inside was a breathtaking, custom-made, heavy black leather motorcycle jacket. It was lined with thick thermal shearling. "The Carhartt is good for the dirt, but this will keep the wind off you," Wrench said, draping the heavy leather over Toby's shoulder. "Check the inside pocket." Toby reached inside the smooth silk lining of the leather jacket. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was the heavy silver Zippo lighter Jim had left on the counter. "You show that Zippo to anyone wearing our patch, anywhere in the world," Wrench said, his eyes locking onto Toby's with fierce, unyielding intensity. "You tell them Big Jim and Wrench said you are under the shield. Nobody touches you. Nobody messes with your mother. You have a problem. You make a call, and we will ride. Do you understand me, Toby?" Toby looked at the 100 imposing men standing in his driveway, the terrifying machines idling behind them, and the thick envelope of cash in his trembling hands, the crushing weight of his family's poverty, the fear of the winter, the exhaustion. It all evaporated in an instant. "I understand," Toby whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracking down his hot, feverish cheeks. Wrench nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. He turned on his heel and walked back to his massive custom chopper. He swung his leg over, kicked the starter, and revved the engine. As one, the 100 Hell's Angels roared back to life. The sound shook the earth, vibrating deep in Toby's chest. He and his mother stood on the porch, wrapped in the freezing winter air, watching as the army of outlaws turned their bikes and thundered back down the snowy road, leaving behind a completely changed life and a debt paid in full. Sometimes, the greatest rewards come from the most unexpected sacrifices. Toby gave away his only defense against the bitter cold, never expecting an army of outlaws to repay his kindness with life-changing generosity. It proves that compassion speaks a universal language, even to the toughest crowds. If this incredible story of brotherhood and unexpected kindness moved you, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories.